on the one hand, this is a quest romance. The frame story of Robert Walton on his voyage to the North Pole is that of a typical quester who always, and it always involves leaving home. And we see the quest romance structure in fairy tales and Arthurian romances, the search for the Holy Grail, and Monty Python's versions of it, and so on. I mean, we've had quest romances forever and ever. The Gothic Romance as a genre became extremely popular just at the time that the Enlightenment was flourishing, almost as a kind of a cautionary tale in the way of what superstition and non-scientific worldview felt like or could feel like. So Gothic romances like The Castle of Otranto and any number of other ones typically have female protagonists, but they can have male ones too, who wander through mysterious castles and encounter ghosts and are terrified out of their minds and are almost destroyed by it, and at the last minute it all turns into not a problem. It turns out that the ghost was, you know, a dog who was loose in the thing, or some kind of hokey ending, and the thing resolves itself into a world that is the rational world that we live in. The early figures who Frankenstein was attracted to in the world of learning, when he wanted to find out the ultimate causes of things, were all figures from the ancient and medieval world. They were alchemists and magicians and pseudoscientists, but certainly not Enlightenment scientists, Agrippa and Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus and these other figures who were sort of quasi-scientists. And he comes out of that too, and eventually, studies mathematics and then studies real science in Ingolstadt, and learns how to create monsters, right? If the world of Gothic romance is this world that sort of returns you to the world of rationality after you've had a brief excursion in something else, Frankenstein as a novel does just the opposite. It uses the world of rationality and science to get you to a place that is monstrous. And so, again, generically speaking, it introduces a genre and then undermines it by contrast with it, on top of its being an allegory and quest romance at the same time. And then the final one of these generic possibilities for Frankenstein that I wanted to mention is what we could call the trauma narrative. We might think of the stories that Freud elicited from his patients through hypnosis or something, where there is a story of tremendous pain and suffering that then repeats itself and infiltrates the entire life of the person ever afterwards, so that the trauma narrative is typically a narrative of being haunted by the past in some way, but in this case, past pain, past trauma. And it creates compulsive narratives because they constantly return. They can never escape from that traumatic event, no matter how it's discussed or it's experienced in the first place. And Mary Shelley actually incorporates a little snippet from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is one of the archetypal narratives of trauma. Remember that the mariner had, as a fluke, as it were, without really thinking about it, shot an albatross when he was on board a ship on a long voyage. And it turned out that the albatross was the mascot of the ship, and without it, the ship lost its good luck, became becalmed. Everybody on it died, except for the ancient mariner who survived somehow in this horrific world of dead bodies that were there on the ship. And ever afterwards, he collars people wherever he can find them and retells his story. So in the poem, he tells his story to a wedding guest, and after the wedding guest hears this story, this is the way that he is described, that is the wedding guest: like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. And that idea of being haunted, of always having at your back the fiend that is never going to leave you again, is a kind of prophecy of the way that Frankenstein affected our culture, in a sense, because once that fiend, Frankenstein's monster, was loosed into the Western world, and probably by now the whole world, it has never left us. And nobody can get over this story. It so powerfully infects the imagination.